give this a shot. This might go horribly wrong, I don't know. But the general idea is if people have questions that have been, maybe too much to ask in the quick little questions time at the beginning of the thing, or I don't know. We'll see what I can answer. And if I don't have an answer and can show you, I thought at a minimum I could show you how I find answers, because I'm very good at finding answers, and that's something that I think some people have trouble. Some of the reason why they get stuck and have problems is they don't know the best way to find that answer. So let's go on to collaboration here. All right, so I basically created some workspace. Yes.
I think I missed the new part. So I'm new here.
Well, welcome.
Ever been here before? So my name is Mark Baker, and I just moved here from Vancouver, Canada, literally 3 weeks ago. And for work, so I'm working for a company called Copper.io, and I'm trying to go to meetups such as this one, because most of our apps are built on Ruby, and then our sites are built on Ruby on Rails. And I'm just looking to connect with like-minded people. So
Awesome. Well,
yeah.
welcome.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks.
So, all right. Any questions that people have? I'm disappointed Nancy didn't come, because she obviously had some questions.
Yeah.
You were about to say what you brought with you.
Oh, what I started with is I didn't know what to bring, so I basically created kind of a space on my computer with a gem set called Playground, and I made an empty gem and an empty Rails app, and figured if any of those questions pertain to any of that, I could have a spot to work in, or anything. And if I don't get any questions, I do have a few other things I can talk about, but I'll try and get some questions.
I'd like to see if nobody else wants to go first, I'd like to see the quickest way to get into some kind of basic Rails app without having to set up a database or a minimal database, something where you don't have to install stuff and configure passwords and things like that. Worry about other applications on your system.
Yeah, so that would not be this one, because I did set this up with Postgres, but we can easily create another one real quick. So if you just do Rails new and give it a name, by default, Rails new is going to, if you don't tell it a database, it's going to use SQLite, I believe. And so you can do Rails new, Playground Lite, and hit go. And it'll take a second to bundle up. While that's doing that, I can show you what we've got in here. So we got this little thing, and if you go under config and look under the database.yml, it's using SQLite, which you don't have to install anything because it's basically got, I don't think you do anyway. SQLite is just...
Once the bundle
is there, you've got it. So at this point, you can just start doing Rails stuff, and you don't have to do anything special. And at any point, you can change this out and decide to go with a different database, because you're probably not going to actually launch a Rails app on SQLite.
Please no.
But if you want to get started fast, the fastest way is actually Rails new, and it will just give you a default that doesn't require anything else on your system. That is assuming you already have Ruby, but that may be assuming a little bit too much. But showing you how to quickly get Ruby up and going is a little bit more involved and machine specific.
So is it actually going to run will the tests pass right away?
Yes, so we made that, and so if we go into playground light and rake should run the tests, except that function default. Let's see what it's got in the tests.
Just kind of
Yeah, they're just empty, so there aren't any tests, so yes, it does run. I mean, if we made some tests, but if we actually make a model really quick, we can do Rails G model host,
Why has this never been my experience?
and we'll give it a title.
Because you use Windows.
Well, not for Rails.
And then we'll say
What do you have to do?
create DB migrate. And then
one other advantage of going with SQLite, you don't need DB create or DB drop or any of that stuff. You just write DB migrate and it just works.
if I was in my Postgres app in the other directory, the first thing I would have to do is rake DB create, and that's going to create the database, and then I can rake DB migrate. And you can rake DB, even if you rake DB create, if you haven't ever run rake DB migrate, then things won't be very happy in Rails because it wants a migration to happen. You don't have to create a migration, but you have to migrate. It sounds silly, but you do. So you need to migrate, even if you're migrating nothing. And then that kind of gets Rails into a bootstrapped mode.
So with no migrations, can you migrate?
Yes.
Yes.
You can rake DB migrate with no migration, and it works just fine. And what that actually does is it sets up your schema table empty. And then Rails is very happy because when it goes to try and figure out how to run the universe, it looks at the schema table and it's there, and it says, I don't have to do anything because there's nothing here, but I'm happy because I know that I don't have anything to do. It's not quite smart enough to realize that if nothing's there, it doesn't have anything to do. You would think it would, but it doesn't. But after we created that, we can now rake, and now it's actually doing something. It's still not doing anything because we didn't have any tests, but now there's potential for tests because we have this model.
You didn't type bundle or anything like that.
When I did Rails new at bundle. And I didn't add any other gems.
As of Rails 4.
Yeah. You have to tell it now not to
Not to
bundle
bundle.
if you don't want it to bundle.
So it assumes you have bundler installed?
Yes. Yeah.
One thing I noticed with Rails new is that there are a number of options that you can pass to it.
There are a lot of options to Rails.
And unfortunately, the documentation that's generated when you go to help doesn't tell you which options are the default. Do you know any place where that's documented?
Where the actual defaults are.
Yeah, if you look at the various options, it will tell you, look at all the things you can do, but it doesn't tell you which ones are the default.
Well, -R, it's going to, without being specified, it tells you the default there. -M for using a template, the default is to not use a template.
Right.
So -B is to skip bundler. The default is to run bundler. So, I mean, it doesn't tell you that the default is to run it, but the fact that the flag exists to not run it says that that's the
That's how you
default,
turn it
is to
off.
run it. The same thing with -G. Most of the flags are about turning things off. And so, you know, most of these flags, -B, -G, -O, they're all about saying, don't give me this thing. So the default is to give you that thing.
So it's the same as if you put the no skip.
Sort of, yes.
And then the only one I'm not positive on is -D. Oh, it does have default
It
SQLite.
does. Just
so-
to jump on with what Alex is saying, if you look at this list, you'll notice some of the options are lowercase, some of the ones are uppercase. The uppercase ones are the things that turn off things that will happen if you don't if you don't send them in. The lowercase ones is how you add additional behavior beyond the default. So nearly all of the lowercase ones on the right should have a default next to them, whereas all the capital ones will tell you what skips if you use it.
Yeah.
Everybody follow that?
No.
So notice how all these are capital, right? B, G, O. Those are flags to turn off a feature. All the lowercase ones like -J or -D for database, those are saying override the default with something else. And on those, it says what the default is. So for -D, the default is SQLite. For -J, it's jQuery. So those do tell you what the default are, and those are the ones where you can override. The other flags don't have any options. They're just toggles, turn off something that's already there as a default. The only one that's not like that is -M, where there's no default because the default is to not use a template. So -M is use a template. The default is don't use a template. And then I'll tell you the normal way I set up any Rails project is with these flags. Rails new project -T to turn off test unit because I'm going to use RSpec, and -D Postgres QL to use Postgres because that's the database I use almost always. So those are the flags I use almost always, and you can actually put those in a .railsrc file in your home directory, and anytime you type Rails new, it will just use those flags. So that's a handy way to make sure you always get that on all your Rails projects.
After you're done setting up a Rails project, instead of running rakedb create and rakedb migrate, I'm trying to figure out which ones you should run for the database of data you're currently using. I believe you can just run rakedb setup, which will do the creation and migration for you.
I know rakedb setup will get you set up for sure if you've already been set up, but we can actually try because I didn't actually set up because I knew it might be a question. I knew Paul's question might be a question, so I purposefully didn't set up my Postgres
Before
one.
you do it, do a rate-t and see what that output is. It's possible people don't even know about that output.
So here's the different things you can do with rate in your database. You can create, drop, you can load in fixtures, migrate, you can check the status of your migrations, you can roll back a migration, you can clear out the schema dump, you can make a schema dump, you can load it up. You can seed your database, so if you have a seeds.rb file in your database directory, it will actually run that, and whatever the convention is to put stuff in there that will put seed data into your application, but it'll just run seeds.rb, and DB setup will create the database, load the schema, and initialize the seed data. And so that's why I'm not 100% sure if rakedb setup will work, because there is no schema yet.
I think it's just an alias though. I think it actually does run db create, db migrate.
Okay. So rake db setup. Nope. Schema.rb doesn't exist yet. Run rake db migrate. So you have to create, migrate, and then once there's already a schema.rb, the next person who comes along can just do rake db setup, but without the schema.rb, it won't work.
I thought that was just an alias.
So,
Yeah, I think it's different when you are first.
yeah. Because I think what rakedb setup actually does is it is an alias, but I think it's an alias for rakedb create, rakedb schema load. And because schema does not exist yet, it can't load the schema.
I see. You're right.
But if I think it did create the database, so if I try running db create, it already exists, and then I can rake db migrate,
Yeah.
and I can migrate with no migrations, but now everything's a lot happier because now I can rate DB setup and it should just tell me that it's already set up. Ta-da. And then I can just rake and, oh, because I told it no tests on this project. I did the standard flags I always do, and I didn't actually install our spec maker yet.
So there is an initial migration, it's the schema migrations table.
Correct.
There is an initial migration that's built into Rails.
Right.
You don't see it.
You have to generate it though.
No, you don't even have to generate it. It's just migrate, and the schema migration
Oh, it's not
is built into Rails. If you look in the project file
The schema
folder,
file's in P right now?
yeah.
Oh,
So if
wow.
I go into app DB, I have schema.rb and seed.rb. There's no migrations. I
Does
have-
the schema file?
The schema.rb is just the schema.rb file. It's not a migration file. It's the schema.rb
But I mean, it
file.
doesn't contain its own
No.
meta table.
Not until you actually change the state of the database.
I see.
And Nick had a question, but he just left. Anyone else have a question?
Well, this isn't really a question, but it might be interesting to show people that source code at DB setup. Like show how you
Sure.
would go about finding that.
Yeah, so that's a good point, is whether it's with Rails or it's often not Rails necessarily, but it's definitely a lot of the gems I use. It's often not Rails because usually the documentation for Rails is fairly decent. Documentation on other gems is not as great. So I often make my own documentation by looking at the gems source code and whatnot. So there's a couple of ways that that you can look at what Rails is. You can go to GitHub and actually look at it on GitHub, or you can just open up the Rails gem right inside of your application, or any other gem. So we can So this opens up Rails, which Rails itself doesn't have a whole lot in it, because Rails, the gem, they've extracted a lot of Rails into other gems. So you'll want to open those up. So rather than trying to figure out what gem, what I'm looking for is actually in with Rails, I like to go the GitHub route. But that is how you can open up a gem to look what's inside of the gem and dig through it. So to get to what David was saying as far as, looking at the DB setup,
I think that's the rail tags, is that what tags are?
It's probably an active record.
Active record tags, the DB tags matrix.
yeah, so it's going to probably be under active record, under with, and there's no tasks, so maybe it's under those, and that's generators, active record, tasks, and database tasks. You can see a lot of different stuff, and none of which are the actual tasks yet. Actually, none of those are tasks.
It's crazy interesting.
One of the specific ones were there's one for Postgres, one for MySQL. That's actually right there.
So I think that they must be, so if we look at the Postgres database task, which is what we were running into there, that still doesn't have what I'm looking for. So they evidently,
I don't think it's there.
Search all of Rails for setup.
It's a funny dot rate.
Yeah, there's not even a .rate file there. So.
No, they don't exist in .rate files. They exist as extracted out tasks nearly everywhere.
Yeah. So unfortunately, the Rails source code is often hard to read through.
Just for the fun of it, hop into, since you're looking at, where are you? Hop out of active record.
Hop out of active record.
And into where ties.
Rail ties. Lib.
Rate files.
So we do have rates here, but none of the DB stuff because we're outside of active record.
What about going from the rate file that you have installed?
The rate file doesn't have anything here.
Press T and type dot rate, and it'll give you all the rate
That's
files.
what I was
Something in it that makes it.
Yeah, it'll have.
Well, yes, but it's just loading up.
They'll tell you which file to load, and you can look at that file. So it's not required.
It's Rails application load tasks.
It's the hard thing here is you can't really grab for 7.
You can find it with the GitHub fuzzy search. So you press T on the keyboard and type dot rate. T.
T.
Dot rate.
Oh.
One of these.
Whoa, that's
I
nice.
should type T.
No, there's no database rates.
That's cool. Oh, wow.
Well, I have another technique for finding the source code, which is, are you using RVM?
I am using RVM.
Okay, well then you can go to, on your console, just go to RVM gemset gemdir and find out where your, which will give you the path where all of your gems are installed.
Yeah.
And then you can CD to that path and then dive down a few levels. And then you can start using find and grep and stuff like that to find what you're looking
Yeah,
for.
you can
And
definitely
I generally
explore
find that
that.
that's a fairly useful way.
On most projects, just doing the bundle open will be good enough because it
Yes.
opens it in your editor and you can just go through your editor and it works pretty nicely. But yeah, that is another way because all of the gems are just on your file system. They're just Ruby. You can go look at them. And if you use RVM, you probably have about 50 copies of every gem, but especially Rails, if you do any number of projects.
You can even modify the code.
Yes.
I mean, you can, for example, you can put in, you can use the
Yeah.
debugger by typing in debugger in different places if you're trying to figure out what's going on in the Rails code.
Yeah, I've had to do that a bunch of times.
Yeah. In general, I would recommend making a backup of any files that you change and then restoring it.
Dave, before you left the room, you had a question, and we went to you on first.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to see a demonstration of your end state gem.
Sure, I can show that. Let me first take you to it on GitHub. So it's under the originate account on GitHub, and it's just called InState. And we have been making all kinds of changes to it in the past few days. Just bumped to 0.4.0 today. And basically, before I get too much into showing it, I want to talk about why it's there and why it's different. So the most prevalent state machine gem out there is called state machine. And the way it works is you use their DSL to build a state machine inside of a class that you want to transition through states. And the most prevalent use case is to build it inside of an active record model. So you would build out your your state machine by describing it using their domain-specific language, and then it gives your model this crazy number of methods, and you have to add in, usually if you have a complex state machine of any nature, it creates a model file that's in the hundreds of lines long. And there's a lot of us who don't like our models to do very much other than hang out and maybe persist our data for us. And so the idea with in-state is you still use a nifty little DSL to create the state machine, but what you do is you create a class that subclasses from in-state state machine, and it will create a class for you that when you new it up, you give it an object to basically wrap. And so it's acting as a delegator, a decorator type object, and when you wrap the object, it will then use the rules you define in setting up your state machine class to allow you to then transition through the various states. So everything is external to your actual class that you might, your actual object that you might be managing state on, and it's all defined in a separate class. And even further, it encourages / forces you, if you want to have your state machine do anything interesting, to create even more classes for doing interesting things. So at the most basic state machine here is a very simple one that just says you can transition from A to B, and we put a little alias for a Go event on there. You can transition from B to C, and you can transition from either B or C to A. All that will do is give you something that if you wrap an object like this that has a state attribute, you can transition through the different states. You get a transition method. You can also find out what state it's in. You can ask it if it's in a specific state. You can use a bang on a state to transition to that state, or at least attempt to. And you'll get a true false as to whether it did transition. You can now, as of today, Russ, set an initial state. By default, if you don't set initial state, your initial state will be set for you to the special ___ nil ___. That's only if your state is not there. So if you wrap an object that has a state that is nil, you'll get that state, basically, because we ran into issues where it didn't like not having a state at all. So you'll get this initial state unless you tell us a different initial state, or always make sure you wrap objects that have a state to begin with. You can set up guards, which basically are things that have to be true in order to make that transition. And this is where the idea of keeping things where they belong and separated out are the first area. So a guard is just another class. So you can subclass in-state guard, and you just have to implement a will allow method that returns true or false. And what you do to implement that is totally up to you, but we'll instantiate this guard and give it a few things to play with. We'll give it the wrapped object, the desired state, and optionally, if your transition had any parameters, we'll hand those in as well. And your guard can decide whether or not to allow it to go through or not. But it's just yet another class. Yes?
So would you put like partial validations of an active record model in these guard classes?
You could do some of that. You could do some validation of data. You can, anything that you could potentially want to stop something from transitioning state could go into one of these guards. And then you define that a transition is guarded by these guards by using the block form of the transition definition. So you can go from A to B, but it's got two guards on there. And you just give it the class name of the guard. On the other end, we've got finalizers. The idea being after you transition, you might want to do quite a few things. And so they act almost just like guards. The difference